Welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News.
In sub-Saharan Africa, lack of access to reliable energy is one of the most pressing social and economic issues and a significant contributor to the abysmal outcomes in health, nutrition, food security, education security, business competitiveness, and employment. Our next guest, Dr. Weibe Boer, CEO of All On Energy, an investment firm specializing in off-grid electricity generation. He was born and raised in Jos, Nigeria. He has a PhD from Yale University and is the author of a book titled A Story of Heroes and Epics, The History of Football in Nigeria. He will be giving us his perspective on Nigeria's power problems and possible solutions. We will also be looking at a bit of history and its Nigerian upbringing. Dr. Boer, welcome to the morning show.
Good morning. Welcome to the morning show.
Thanks for having me on.
Now, for the benefit of our viewers who may not know what you do,
yes,
what is off-grid energy solution? What is it all about?
Okay. So I think as every Nigerian knows, we have an abysmal power problem in Nigeria. I would argue that Nigeria's power situation is probably the worst of any country in the world. We have, on a very good day, 2,000 megawatts that go from the grid to customers. In a country that, even for sort of basic economic development, we should actually have about 180,000 megawatts. So that's 178,000 megawatt gap. That is a huge gap. That's a $200 billion gap. And because of that significant gap, Nigerians have basically solved the problem themselves by using self-generation, diesel or petrol generators, either very small ones up to ones that generate several megawatts for big companies. And what my company is doing is we are investing in companies that are coming at this problem with a different solution. So instead of using generators as the off-grid solution, we're encouraging the use of renewable energies to generate the power. And it can be as small as a solar home system that powers just a single house, up to a mini grid, 100 kilowatt mini grid that can power an entire community. With solar, with hydro, with other types of renewable energy. It can be all the way up to a small IPP that generates power and then instead of putting it into the grid, actually provides it directly to consumers.
Oh, you just talked about investing in companies, right? I know that your company, talk to us about the Facility for Energy Inclusion. That's the Offgrid Access Fund.
Yes.
I know that your company recently invested in the African Development Bank that has connection with this. Talk to us about that.
Yes. So, we are a fund that is established by Shell and funded by Shell. And so there's two things we do with our funding in terms of investments. One is direct investments in companies that are delivering these solutions. And then the other is to invest in finance facilities where our investment can actually catalyze a lot of other investment to come into it. So we partnered with the African Development Bank and a number of other investors like the Norwegian Development Fund. And we basically all put money into a fund called the Offgrid Energy Fund for Africa. It will be managed by a fund manager called Lion's Head. They operate in Lagos, Nairobi, and London. And basically, it's an opportunity for us to put some of our money into this fund and then leverage additional money that can address the power problem, not only in Nigeria, but across Africa.
Okay.
Well, how is this different from a venture capital operation?
Well, so we are, what we call ourselves an impact investing fund. Because the industry that we're investing in, the off-grid energy industry in Nigeria is very new. It's very nascent. And so the companies in this space are very new. And so it means they're also high risk. The regulatory environment for this space is also new and untested. And so the typical investor will be quite wary and will probably be waiting and watching for now. And so we're a fund that, because we're an impact investment fund, our interest is both to earn an economic return, but also to create social impact. And for us, it's as important that the investments we make in companies create more connections for Nigerians so that more Nigerians have power. That's as important to us as the financial return that we make.
Well, you talked about the regulatory agency. How does this fit, what you do, Offgrid, how does it fit into the existing regulatory framework?
Right.
And what's the reaction of the discos,
right,
who seem to be in charge of electricity distribution in Nigeria?
Right. So I think, in Nigeria, we've, anyone who's grown up in Nigeria, we've sort of grown up with this idea that power is a system that there's a big generation company, there's transmission, and then there's distribution company that delivers the power to you, and that there's no other option, right? The whole world is actually moving towards a distributed energy approach. Even Germany, which was kind of one of the companies that had the best sort of central grid initially, now has several million generation companies that are as small as, you know, one household generating solar power and selling it to their neighbor. And so that's kind of the approach that we're taking. You know, even up to 2 to 3 years ago, this was almost unheard of in Nigeria. Okay. There was, you know, the government focused completely on the grid, on the sort of traditional top-down power. But in the last couple of years, they've actually introduced some very good regulation. There's the mini-grid regulation that came out in 2017 that basically sets out the parameters for operating a mini-grid and sort of how you engage with the disco and the rights of the disco versus the mini-grid. Then there's also the eligible customer regulation, which basically allows, you know, in the end of the day, sort of willing buyer, willing seller, anybody who generates new electricity can sell it to anyone they want as long as that buyer can prove that they were not getting sufficiently supplied by the disco. So obviously all of these are new and untested. They're both of those key regulations are less than a year old. The discos are obviously in some cases challenging them. In this case, the government is firmly behind the off-grid providers because they want to diversify the energy mix. And you know, it's something that we now have to follow very carefully. It's another reason why, as it's only us impact investors who are really at this point investing in this space, because there is the possibility that some of these regulations could be changed, could be challenged, and then obviously if you make an investment in a company that then now, because of regulatory changes, is now no longer viable, that's a significant threat on your economic return. But the government has put in place the right regulatory framework. It's now just a matter of creating precedent and making sure that those regulatory frameworks are followed by all arms of government.
But do you see the possibility of off-grid investors also providing last-mile infrastructure?
But that is what off-grid is. It's the last-mile infrastructure. It's just the difference is you generate and you distribute the power at the same place, rather than, you know, generating the power at Ughelli and then delivering it to Sokoto. You generate it locally and then distribute it locally, and your customers are, you know, they can walk by the generation facility every day, and so they know where their power comes from.
Well, you talked about diversifying the energy mix in Nigeria. What are the opportunities that are available in that regard?
Right. You know, a country like Nigeria, I think for obvious reasons, we should be one of the world's largest solar energy countries. I mean, we have, you know, one of the resources we have in abundance is the sun, and it's free for now.
Okay.
And so it's actually kind of hard to understand why Nigeria is not already a major user of solar energy. You know, so that's definitely, I think, the most promising one, because there's technologies, business models that can use solar power to deliver either just to a single household, you know, to a community, all the way up to, you know, several hundred megawatts of power, depending on what is needed. So I think solar is a huge opportunity. Hydro in Nigeria is obviously another big opportunity. We obviously have the significant power generation from the hydro dams on the Niger. But, you know, there's also smaller scale hydro that could be used all over the country and is not being used properly. There's something like 300 small scale hydro generation facilities around Nigeria that all, I think, but one of them have never operated. The only one that is operational that I know of is in Taraba State on the Mambila Plateau. Then there's also a hydropower company on the plateau called NESCO, which was an independent utility that was never taken over by NEPA. And because of that, there are 7 local governments in Plateau State that since 1929 have had 24/7 power. It's the only part of Nigeria where you don't need a generator. And again, that's something that people don't realize, but there's no reason why using hydropower where it's available, we couldn't do that all over the country. Wind is also another opportunity in Nigeria, definitely along the coast and even in the middle belt, north-central Nigeria. Because of the mix of the winds coming from the Sahara and from the coast, apparently that area is really good for wind generation. But again, wind hasn't really been developed that much in Nigeria, but there are business models and technologies that even allow you to do sort of a mini wind turbine on your house and generate just for your house. So all of these technologies and business models exist. The one that's really kind of starting to take off in Nigeria is solar. But I think in the next few years, we're going to see a lot of really exciting innovation. And some of the companies that are starting in these now are going to be the next MTNs, the next Globacom, because these are going to be the sort of large-scale, customer-facing retail power providers that we don't have yet.
Okay.
Well, I'm most challenged because earlier on you referred to challenge by the discos. I guess, you know, you are talking about their reaction to the customer declaration by NERC. How much of a threat does that pose to, you know, off-grid investors?
Yeah, it's a significant threat. You know, look, at this point, the discos are for the most part largely insolvent and don't even have the capital and cannot even raise the capital to fill the gaps in their service, right? So they actually can't afford to buy meters so that they can properly assess the power usage of customers. They can't afford to fix transformers. They can't afford to expand, you know, power lines, etc. And so our hope is that instead of the discos, you know, now fighting this, they make alliances. And so some of what we're actually trying to do is to create those conversations so that, you know, if a mini-grid company wants to operate, let's say in Ogun State, they go to the disco, the Ibadan disco, and they say, okay, look, this is what we want to do. How can we work with you? How can we, you know, enhance your power provision? How can we even maybe leverage some of your infrastructure that's being underutilized, and actually make it a win-win rather than a battle? Because look, the power problem in Nigeria, you know, what you mentioned at the beginning, it is the foundational development problem in this country. It is why we have poor education outcomes, poor health outcomes, low employment, poor productivity, poor competitiveness, everything you say. Without power, you're always going to have that problem.
But how did we get it wrong? I mean, you've been in Nigeria for as long as I've been here.
Yeah.
You were born here, right?
Yes.
In Jos, so you know the story. There was a time in this country when power was not a problem. Where did we go wrong? We have gas, we have hydro, we have all of this. So what went wrong?
I think we all know the answer to that.
No,
but
I don't know.
I'd rather talk about the exciting future rather than the past.
Okay. All right. So what do you think? What is your assessment of the African continent? Do you think universal energy access is feasible in the near future with all of these?
Well, you know, if you look at what happened with mobile, right? You know, if you think about it, in the early days of mobile, when, for example, when MTN paid for a license in Nigeria, I think it was like $200 million in around 2000. You know, their stock value in South Africa crashed because they said, why would you put 200 million naira into a license for mobile in a country where nobody, you know, no more than 200,000 people can possibly afford this? You know, now, I mean, you know, MTN is facing certain issues right now, but I mean, the amount, I think they generate $5 billion a year revenue from Nigeria, and there's, what, 70 million customers? That's more than the population of South Africa, right? So I actually see, if the right business models and the right price point, and people are allowed to kind of pay for power incrementally, even by the day, which is actually possible now with some of these business models, power can now become almost democratized, and people can kind of choose for themselves, okay, I want to get power from that source rather than that source. And it becomes affordable. I think we can achieve it. I mean, it's a massive gap. Like I said, in Nigeria, we're talking about a $200 billion gap. But that's a $200 billion gap if you start from the top down with the traditional generation, transmission, disco approach. You know, with the bottom-up approach, you can do it incrementally, and it's driven by consumers themselves and by small businesses themselves. So I think it's not something that's impossible. You know, if someone told you 20 years ago that by this point Africa would be, or Nigeria in particular, would have, you know, 70, 80%, you know, cell phone coverage and penetration, people would have laughed at you. So I think, you know, 10 to 15 years from now, I believe we can be there with power, as long as these kinds of companies and innovations and business models are allowed to operate and thrive, and sort of get the right investment they need to scale.
You talked about an ongoing conversation. Do you see the possibility at some point in the future of off-grid investors collaborating with the discos? Or they are so agitated about the competition that opportunity may not exist?
I actually think there is an opportunity. There's actually something that's brewing right now that I can't talk about yet, but could become very interesting, where it's a close collaboration where the discos and the off-grid players are actually the same company.
Well, let's talk about you and Jos. Okay. You were born in Jos, you grew up in Jos.
Yes.
So you are just as Nigerian as we are.
Yeah, except I was denied my citizenship, but that's another story.
You were denied your citizenship?
Yes.
But you're also an author, correct?
Yes.
And with your new book, I thought you had the copy of the book. Where is that?
Emmanuel has it. Maybe he can So, you know, the off-grid energy investment is my day job.
Okay.
My side hustle is I'm an author, right?
Okay.
And so I wrote a book on the history of football in Nigeria. It's actually it's taken from my doctoral dissertation.
Okay.
From almost 15 years ago from Yale. And basically what the inspiration was is I wanted to write a history of Nigeria that was positive, national, and unifying. And, you know, for several years I asked many Nigerians, any Nigerian I met, what is one thing that unites us and that is positive and historical? And the only answer that I got, regardless of, you know, ethnicity, gender, religion, age, socioeconomic class, was football is what unites us.
Okay.
And so this is actually the story of how that happened, how something completely foreign, that it's so foreign that there's no major indigenous language in Nigeria that even has a word for ball, meaning this isn't something that there was a similar game in pre-colonial times that now, you know, people took to because this was similar to that. It was completely new. And the first game that we've found recorded in Nigeria was in 1904. And, you know, by 1960, by independence, I mean, football was intrinsic to national identity, national pride. You know, part of the independence celebrations were actually football tournaments. And so I think it's basically telling that story. And it was a way to say, look, in Nigeria, we often talk about that we're a country that is divided and we don't have anything in common, but this is something we do have in common, and let's celebrate that, and let's try and build a sense of unity beyond that, though.
Well, Dr. Boer, see, sometimes we do magic, you know. Yeah.
Wow.
I managed to produce the book.
Wow.
Yeah, but I would like to talk a bit about the book.
Okay.
But I'm interested in the point you made about citizenship.
Yes.
Why were you denied? What was the reason that they gave?
So, you know, most people don't realize this, but this is actually one of the most difficult countries in the world to naturalize in. Being born here means nothing. It doesn't give you any rights. And so the way to naturalization is you have to have 16 years of continuous residence. 16, 1-6. That's a very long time. If you're a foreign woman married to a Nigerian man, you can, but not the other way around. So if you're a Nigerian woman and you have a foreign husband, he cannot get citizenship through you. So I think that's a women's rights issue as well. And then the other is if you have a Nigerian grandparent. So clearly I don't have a Nigerian grandparent. I'm not, and so when I was 16, I took the route of, okay, I've been in Nigeria for 16 years. So I took my birth certificate and I went to the immigration office in Jos at the Federal Secretariat. And I went there to apply. And the immigration officer just looked at me and said, what, you want to do what? And I said, I want to apply for my citizenship. I'm 16, I've been here 16 years. Yeah. He said, okay, wait. He went and called everybody he could find. He said, oh yeah, ask me again. So he asked me again, and I said, okay, I want to apply for my citizenship. And it was like people were rolling on the floor for 45 minutes laughing because they just said, you know, I wasn't just this like white, I was this skinny little, I wasn't just any white kid, I was like the skinniest little, and the whitest blonde white kid. And here I wanted to be a Nigerian, and they just thought it was just kind of funny. But that was in 1990, right? And so Nigeria was under military rule. You know, we had a very bad global reputation, and Nigeria only allowed single citizenship. And so the immigration officer, he had me fill in the form, and then he immediately stamped it denied.
And but the Nigerian Constitution says if you are born here, you are a Nigerian.
No, read the Constitution.
Oh,
it doesn't. It doesn't.
Really?
Okay.
1999 Constitution, you have no rights. Birth gives you no rights.
Okay.
I mean, it's the same thing, just like if you're born in Plateau State, but your parents are from Oshun, you have no rights as an indigent of Plateau.
But do you plan to reapply?
Yes, I do. But
when?
you know, the 16 years, I moved back here 8 years ago, and the 16 years restarts. So technically, I have to wait another 8 years before I can apply.
Okay, but do you speak any Nigerian language?
So
because that's part of the
requirement. Beyond the residency, then you have to speak a major language. So Inajan Hausa.
Oh,
so,
nice.
Yeah, so I can speak Hausa, and then you have to prove that you've acclimated to Nigerian culture, which isn't defined. But I imagine, you know, if I can eat pounded yam with my hands, maybe that counts. I don't know. And then you have to get approved by your local government chairman, your traditional ruler, your state governor, and then your president. So my local government. So before I lived in Plateau, I actually lived in Taraba State. Okay. So I'm from Wukari. Okay. So that one is straightforward. I know the Akuka, who's our traditional ruler. The local government chairman is no problem. The governor has already said when I'm ready, he's ready to sign for me. And then it has to go to the president. the president of Nigeria has to sign on every naturalization.
Wow, we have been schooled here
Yeah,
on
which is obviously
citizenship.
unusual.
Well,
Wow.
I mean, I look forward to when you get your citizenship.
All right,
You know,
me too.
because you are one of us.
Yes, thank you, sir.
Now,
Thank you.
this is your book.
Yes.
It starts in 1904 and
Yeah.
ends 1960.
Yes,
During
yes,
the
yeah.
colonial period.
Yes,
Yeah, but at the same time, the point has been made that football developed because it was a form of protest
Yes.
against colonial domination.
Yeah.
The British colonialists, they wanted polo, they wanted
Yep.
cricket.
Yep. Yep.
So how did that happen?
Did you read the book? Wow. Okay. Perfect. Yes. So exactly. So you know, in sports was very much part of the kind of colonial setup, but it was also, you know, in Britain there were hierarchies of sport, right? And so the elites obviously played cricket, played polo, and you know wouldn't be caught dead kicking a ball around, you know. And so the you know, colonial elite, the sort of senior administrators, the senior military officers, all played cricket, and then in the north they all played polo. And so their hope was that Nigeria would also now take that on. What happened instead, though, is that football was introduced to Nigeria through sort of the lower, or let's say the middle class British who came to Nigeria, the missionaries. So the first game was actually at Hope Waddle Training Academy, which was a Presbyterian mission school in Calabar.
June 15, 1904.
Yeah, exactly. And so that was an example where it was the missionaries who brought it, not the colonial officials. It was spread through Nigeria through, you know, officials of the railway, but not the senior guys, the mid-level people that, you know, who were playing, by the traders, people who worked for companies like UAC, that kind of thing. So they were the ones who in the end spread it around Nigeria, and it was by Nigerians kind of rejecting and saying, look, cricket, we're not interested in that elite sport. We want to play football. It's something we can be passionate about. The other thing too is there was never any really significant Nigerian leader who kind of said, oh, I love cricket and I'm going to make it a Nigerian game. That's what happened in India.
Okay.
But in Nigeria we had actually people like Nnamdi Azikiwe. Most people don't realize this, but Nnamdi Azikiwe was actually a football star. He played on a professional, well, semi-professional team in Lagos in the 1920s. He was the captain of the Lincoln University football team in the United States. And then when he came back to Nigeria, eventually he founded something called the Zeke's Athletic Clubs. And these were clubs where everybody, regardless of, you know, ethnicity or whatever, could join if you were passionate about sports. And each of the clubs, you know, in major cities around Nigeria had a football team, or in Lagos there was like a Zeke 1, 2, 3, you know, there's three teams. And those became kind of, in the 30s and 40s, became kind of the top teams. During World War II, he actually took the best 11 from his Zeke athletic clubs around Nigeria and took them on tours around the country, 2 of them. And the tours were said to be raising money for the war fund. And so obviously the colonial officials would support it. And you would have this situation where you'd have, you know, a football game happening in, you know, cities all over Nigeria. And he would give a speech about democracy and sort of anti-colonialism, but in the spirit of, we are fighting for democracy through the war, and this is supporting the war. So clearly, when this war is over, we too will get freedom. And it was anti-colonial protest that was disguised, because he would be doing this and the senior colonial official would be right next to him, because it was supporting the war effort. So it was a very clever way of using football to protest colonialism.
Quickly, before we go, you talked about
Yeah.
Nigeria being a sport symbol of cultural, football being a symbol of Nigerian cultural identity.
Right.
How do you mean?
Well, I meant more of a sort of it helped create a national identity. So by, you know, through those efforts of Azikiwe and others, you know, it was one of the few things that early on, already from the 40s, people were talking about having a national team, and national competitions like the Governor's Cup. And so it really helped create that sense of being Nigerian. A lot of people don't realize this, but until the early 1950s, the term Nigerian actually just meant anyone who was living in this territory, right? So there were African Nigerians, and there were European Nigerians, and there were Lebanese Nigerians. It wasn't a national identity. But in the 1950s, one of the major ways that was created, and Nigerian came to mean what it is now, is that the Nigerian national team would play against the Gold Coast annually. And it was like the beginnings of what was a sort of solid Nigerian identity versus that of the Gold Coast.
Well, a lot has changed since 1949, since 1960, since 1904. Do you plan to write a sequel to this?
I'm actually writing the prequel.
Oh, nice.
Okay.
So, you know, after 1960, football got a little complicated.
Yeah.
And it's often been embroiled in politics and all that. So I'd rather leave that to someone else, and I'm gonna write the prequel to this. What happened in the 1800s?
Okay. And so where
Was there football then in Nigeria?
No, that was before there was football. There was other things happening.
Okay. Your PhD is in history, right? I guess.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Boer, for coming to the morning show.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed.
It's time now for a short break on the morning show. When we return, politician and economist Tope Fashua will be joining us in the studio. Don't go away.